This is Steve Koleno, and this is Confidential Remarks. An efficient free market always relies on a single axiom: a frictionless, direct connection between supply and demand. For over a century, the buying and selling of real property has functioned within a framework that mimics this type of simple asset exchange. However, the actual flow of capital is routed through a specific gate. A managed layer sits between the buyer and seller, redirecting the transaction. This deviation suggests the transaction takes place within a strictly managed environment. For market strategists and executives, identifying the logic of this environment is a diagnostic necessity for understanding current disruptions. Authority within this system is centralized through the maintenance of information asymmetry. This imbalance is upheld by two specific variables: exclusive access to property inventory and the implementation of standardized commission rates. These factors work in tandem to restrict standard price discovery. When the consumer lacks visibility into the data or the cost of the service, they rely on the intermediary to navigate the market. In this model, the stability of the ecosystem depends on the consumer remaining separated from the underlying mechanics of the transaction. In the early 1900s, real estate was a localized service. Storefronts like this functioned as low-friction connection points, matching buyers with properties in the vicinity. At this stage, value was tied to the physical asset. Advertisements focused on square footage and price, with little emphasis on the intermediary's identity. Following the Second World War, suburban housing volume expanded. This rapid growth introduced significant logistical friction into the process of matching buyers with specific homes. As the volume of properties grew, the focus of the industry shifted. Intermediaries identified that controlling the logistics of the market was more profitable than simply assisting with a single sale. Rapid market expansion created the logistical requirement for institutional oversight, which became the foundation for market control. To manage the increasing volume, industry operators formed private organizations to centralize and store property records behind closed doors. This tracks the evolution of the multiple listing service into an institutional vault, locking market data inside a private network. This velvet rope economy excluded buyers and sellers from independent participation. Accessing inventory now required a specific portal, the licensed agent. The economic model transition. The industry shifted from a competitive service model to one defined by institutional rent-seeking. By consolidating the data within the MLS, the industry ensured that the consumer remained dependent on the gatekeeper for market visibility. The foundation of the legacy market is strictly supported by three interlocking pillars: exclusive data, standardized commissions, and intentional complexity. The first pillar, exclusive data, creates a monopoly. Restricting listing access prevents the consumer from negotiating from a position of knowledge. This chart illustrates the second pillar, standardized commissions. While the quality of service varies, the commission rate remains fixed. This rigid structure creates a price floor. It prevents the cost of the transaction from reacting to the actual value or complexity of the service provided. The third pillar is intentional complexity. The industry utilizes dense procedural requirements, often presented as a necessary safety measure. When we compare the public narrative against the operational reality, we see that standard practices are often the tools used to maintain the artificial price floor. Procedural confusion keeps the focus on the gatekeeper's guidance rather than the mechanics of the cost. These three pillars effectively separate the financial cost of the transaction from the performance delivered to the consumer. Within this network, the role of the consumer underwent a specific shift. With data locked in the MLS, agents stopped competing on finding homes. Competition shifted to brand wars, where the agent's persona became the primary product. Trust became a line item, an expense generated through franchise fees and marketing campaigns, rather than a direct result of service. This leads to the commoditization of the consumer. In this network, the home buyer is converted into a data packet, ingested by lead generation platforms, and sold back to the agent. In this model, the home buyer is not the primary client. They are the data being captured, packaged, and monetized by the ecosystem. The adoption of the internet introduced an external vector that challenged the legacy model's architecture. Digital networks targeted the industry's most critical asset, the exclusive control of property data. As listings began to appear on open networks, the requirement for a gatekeeper to access basic market information began to diminish. This shift moved the consumer from a role of passive reliance to one of active participation, creating friction within the institutional structures. The redistribution of information alters the asymmetry that the legacy control structure utilized for the last century. This correction represents the transition to the open access framework. This contrasts the legacy mechanics against the open access model. On the left, the ecosystem relies on high friction extraction and intermediary dependency. On the right, consumer autonomy drives the network. Data moves freely, and intermediaries function strictly as advisory guides. In this new environment, value is tied strictly to navigational and advisory services. The monetization of data access is no longer a viable strategy. The architecture of control has been bypassed. Transparency now dictates market forces, allowing the consumer, equipped with the data, to decide the outcome. This has been Confidential Remarks.